Chapter 2. The Tadpole. Jiro was playing house with Okane and Otsuru, the daughters of Ohama, sitting together on a straw mat spread at the corner of the yard by the old schoolhouse. A peaceful atmosphere hung over the place, not a sound in the vicinity. As far as the eye could see, all around were golden rice fields. The warm sun was shining down upon the three children absorbed in playing. This was an unforgettable scene that haunted Jiro at times, one of his oldest memories when he was 5 or 6 years old. Ohama and her family were working as keepers for the village elementary school. Ohama and her husband, their 2 daughters, and Ohama's own parents shared a gloomy matted room and the adjoining wooden-floored one annexed to the buildings. Jiro had been thrown into this mixed family. The reader may wonder why Jiro and his brother Kyoichi were put out as a nursling into such a vulgar family. It was because of their mother's educational philosophy. Otami was born and brought up as a daughter of a dedicated warrior's family. Quite often she had been told the anecdote of Mencia's mother that she moved out 3 times for the benefit of her son, finally to a house in front of a school. She was so deeply moved by the story that she had long wanted to put that great mother's idea into practice when she had children of her own. The Ohama family seemed to be a most desirable place because they were living in a real school building day and night. So mad was she about her dream that she did not mind in the least such facts that the keeper's room was so small and unclean. Ohama herself had been a rich traveling musician, and that Kansaku, her husband, had been fired from a coal mine company and drifted to the village. Well, that aside, shall we return to the sunny side where the 3 children are playing? Jiro sat in the center of the straw mat like a prince, while Okane and Otsuru were waiting on him with a tin plate of berries, sand cakes, and so on. Jiro put his chopsticks to each of them in mimicry. Their game had been going on for about an hour, so Jiro was getting tired of it. Every time he played with the 2 girls, Jiro finally paired with Otsuru, leaving Okane by herself. Probably it was because Otsuru was the same age as himself and Okane was as old as his brother Kyoichi. Besides, Okane was cross-eyed. Otsuru had well-fleshed cheeks and round eyes that looked at you directly, which was perhaps another reason why he was more attracted to her. However, Otsuru had one defect that Jiro regretted, a birthmark on her fleshy left cheek. It looked like a tadpole in shape and size as well. Growing weary of his role, Jiro turned away from Okane to sit face to face with Otsuru. That tadpole naturally caught his eye. She was steadily cutting grass to put into the tin can, not aware of his gazing at all. Her cheeks had grown pink owing to long exposure to the sun, making the tadpole appear in clear relief. It looked alive and wiggling. As he watched it, Jiro felt somehow uneasy. A minute or so passed when he extended his index finger to her cheek and brushed the tadpole softly as if he were afraid of it. Otsuru had no idea why he touched her cheek like that. In surprise, she turned to him, revealing the tadpole directly to him. Behind Jiro was Okane, giggling with her eyes even more crossed. Jiro felt awkward, as if he had done something wrong. A boy will sometimes behave roughly when he feels awkward. All at once he rose to his feet and began kicking the playthings in all directions. Okane gave a cry. Then Jiro fell on Otsuru and twisted her cheek where the tadpole was with all his might. She burst out crying, and her sister ran to the keeper's room, calling, "Daddy." In a few minutes, Jiro's hands were grasped hard within Kansaku's great palms. "What in the world did you do to Otsuru?" he roared in an angry voice, holding him up violently. He felt an acute pain on his wrist and shoulders, but did not cry out. He was swinging his feet to kick at Kansaku's belly. "You devil!" he cried and threw him down to the ground. Jiro fell flat on his face. His palms, lips, nose, and knees ached so hard as if they had been crushed. Lying there for a few seconds, Jiro uttered a cry like a goose being squeezed to death. Otsuru was still lying on her face on the mat, crying bitterly. When she heard Jiro start crying, she cried out even more loudly. They went on crying as if they were competing with each other. Kansaku was still staring down at Jiro with a fierce look. Then Ohama came up with a bamboo broom, putting her sweeping aside. "What's this?" she cried to her husband. "I don't know what it was for," Kansaku said. "But this bad boy twisted Otsuru's cheek quite hard." "So you threw Jiro-san to the ground, you say?" "Sure, yes." "What do you mean by yes?" said Ohama reproachfully. "Isn't this just a children's prank? Where can you find a grown-up who will break into such a thing?" "Don't you mind if your own daughter is bullied like this, Ohama?" "What nonsense," she shouted. "I'm bringing up my children because I love them." "How about you? Do you love them at all? Day after day you're idling away and don't care to earn a farthing, are you? How can you do this at all?" Kansaku turned away and kept silent. When Jiro found that Ohama seemed to have the advantage, he felt relieved and cried out afresh to attract sympathy from his nurse. At the same time, Otsuru also screamed as if to compete against Jiro. "Stop your crying, Otsuru," said Ohama a little provokingly to her daughter. Then she turned to Jiro, who was still lying on his face, and said, "I'm sorry, Jiro-chan." In the company of other people, Ohama used the word Master Jiro, but she called him Jiro-chan when they were alone. "Jiro-chan," she said, "you're a big boy, so you can look after yourself, can't you? Get up now." Jiro, however, kicked his legs violently and cried out loudly. Ohama had to put her broom on the ground and raised him up. "Dear me," she cried. Blood was oozing out about his nose and mouth, though it was just a bit. Straightening herself, she turned to her husband and shouted, "You bruised master's face." Kansaku was beating the dust off Otsuru. He saw Ohama's furious face and started for the house as if nothing had happened. "Wait!" she screamed and ran after him with the broom. a very hard blow was given him on the head. "What's this?" he roared with a beastly look. "Damn your what's this," she cried. "How dare you injure master on the face?" Then she started beating him all over blindly, not only his face but his hands and everywhere. Kansaku was guarding himself with his hands for some time, but her attacking grew more violent. With a disgusting shit, he turned and ran to leap over the ditch, fleeing to the footpath between the rice fields. "You ungrateful, good-for-nothing," Ohama cried, running after him, but when she came to the ditch, she gave up the idea of leaping over and kept calling him names. Jiro and Otsuru stood there, gaping in bewilderment. Tears had disappeared from their eyes, but their faces were stained and smudged with the mud mixed with tears. The tadpole on Otsuru's cheek was lost in the mud, and Jiro had completely forgotten it. Chapter 3. The Earlobe. It was dusk on a summer's day. Jiro went out of the keeper's room riding on the shoulders of Naokichi, a young servant at his own house, aged 22 or 3. He had come to take the young boy back to his parents' house as he was told to do so by Otami. They came to a forked path across the rice fields. Riding on people's shoulders was a favorite thing to Jiro. Recently, however, he hadn't experienced it because Kansaku didn't play with him very often. It was at the right time that Naokichi came up to see him after a long interval. After exchanging a few words with Ohama, he offered to give him a ride on his shoulders. How excited he was! There was a big swamp about 100 meters to the north of the village school, where a number of fireflies ought to be seen flying about that time of the day. Jiro knew that well, so he hoped to be taken there to watch them. When they got to the fork, however, Naokichi started in the opposite direction. It was nothing but a doomed direction to Jiro because his parental house was located in that direction. He didn't like it at all just because his father and mother, grandparents, and his 2 brothers lived there. Otami was bold enough to trust Jiro to the schoolkeeper's family because she had been strongly influenced by the story of Mencius' mother, but contrary to her expectation, the son was becoming a little too familiar with the uneducated nurse. Besides, she came to realize that the influence of living under the roof of the schoolhouse was not so great as it had been in the case of Mencius. These days, she made it a rule to send Ohama back by herself when she brought Jiro home. On the other hand, to be separated from his nurse was an ordeal to Jiro. He became close-mouthed, ate very little, and sometimes went so far as to wet his bed at night. The house was too large compared to the narrow, stuffy room of the schoolkeepers where he had been used to living. In that spacious house he felt as if he were deserted. It made him feel restless and terrified. Even if he was joined by Ohama, he couldn't feel easy. When his mother and other adult members spoke to him, they sounded as if his teachers were speaking from the platform. Otami, his own mother, was the most strict. It would have been inevitable, though, for she regarded it as her responsibility to reform his bad habits and teach him good manners. Jiro was not afraid of his big brother Kyoichi. His pale features and girlish behavior kept Jiro from feeling friendly to him. Shunzo, his little brother, was nearly 3 years old. He had been fed on his mother's milk and the youngest, so he acted quite freely with all around himself. He was a most powerful rival to Jiro. His father and his grandfather seemed to be observing him from a distance, while his grandmother pampered him at one time and was very hard at another. In fact, he was not happy at all when he parted from his nurse. Wasn't it natural then that Jiro should become a boy of few words, of little appetite, and sometimes wet his pants in such an uncomfortable place? These behavioral patterns could be attributed to his instinct to guard himself, for when he behaved wrongly, everything went smoothly for him. All the family were embarrassed and had to send for the nurse, who would take him straight back to her shabby home without failure. At the schoolhouse, Jiro could sleep with her again and did not wet his bed at all. About 20 days had passed since Jiro came back to Ohama's house, and his unpleasant memories of his parental house were disappearing. It was just on one of those days that Naokichi came up to the schoolhouse. In the first place, Jiro was not attached to him at all. Besides, he was heading for the direction he hated to go even with Ohama. Jiro's little heart was beating hard. "No, not this way," he cried. "Go that way, opposite." He made an effort to make Naokichi turn back by pulling his ears, but the young man faced southward as fixedly as ever. His steps, far from stopping or turning, became much faster in spite of Jiro's persistent resistance. By and by, he began to sob, but his carrier did not pay any attention to him. He walked on and on without speaking a word to Jiro. In tears, he looked back. The school building was seen in the darkening twilight. As they went on, it became farther and farther away. He regretted too late that he had got on Naokichi's shoulders. Should he give up and go with Naokichi or fight against it? Without hesitation, Jiro chose the latter means. The farther he was from the school, the more faint-hearted he would be. The sooner the better. It was advantageous for him to be on the shoulders, for he could freely catch hold of the carrier's hair or earlobes. Fortunately for him, Naokichi's hair was long enough to grasp, so he pulled it with a jerk. "Ouch!" he shouted, but would not stop for that. Then he plucked up courage to squeeze his earlobes. They were a little slippery and hard to hold on, but he twisted them as hard as he could, digging in with his tiny fingernails. "Ouch! Stop that!" He screamed and let go his hands. Losing his balance, Jiro bent forward. His 10 fingers were still holding the earlobes, but they were too weak to support his weight. The next moment he fell, almost headlong, down to the gravelled ground. He nearly fell into a faint by the shock. It was as if a big firework had burst inside his head, but it was a really precious moment to him. He bounced up like a ball and dashed back. Madly did he run toward the schoolhouse. When he was nearly 50 meters away, he looked back, still running. Was Naokichi chasing him? In the distance, he was seen standing with his hands over his ears. Jiro was relieved but felt horrified to think of Naokichi's angry face. All of a sudden, he was overcome by an indescribable sorrow and fear. He started crying loudly again. When he got to the gate, Ohama was waiting for him with a worried look. Jiro jumped into her breast. Bending down, she kissed him softly on the cheek, which turned his bitter tears into sweet ones. Soon he calmed himself and noticed that his fingertips, with which he was clinging to his nurse, were wet and shiny. Batting his tear-soaked eyelashes, he looked at them carefully. It was blood, dark red and slightly congealed. Jiro thought it would be better for Ohama not to see it. Whimpering like a pampered child, he rubbed his fingers secretly on the nurse's clothes.